currently July 13th, 4:50 p.m. He apologizes, admitting he tried to be honest, strong, kind, and loving, to do the right thing. But he didn't always succeed, and they know it, and he's deeply sorry. But now, none of it matters anymore. He fought until the end, but there's no hope left. 8 days earlier, an elderly man is abruptly awakened by a loud noise and a sudden jolt. He notices water pooling on the floor as he rises from his bed. Making his way through the cabin, he discovers a gaping hole from which water is gushing. Climbing up to the deck, he spots a massive floating container near his yacht, the culprit that collided with his boat and punctured the hull. Despite his efforts to lower the sails and steer away from the container, he finds himself unable to maneuver the yacht as the corner of the metal box becomes lodged in its side. After a brief moment of contemplation, he returns to the cabin and retrieves an inflatable marine anchor. Tossing it onto the container, he climbs aboard, bringing a rope with him. Securing the rope to the corner of the container and anchoring the other end, he tosses it into the sea. Hurrying back to his yacht, he watches as the rope tightens, gradually pulling the container away from his boat. Once the massive metal box is clear, he decides to assess the extent of the damage to his yacht. Upon inspection, he finds a sizable hole with water seeping in whenever the boat tilts. Leveling the yacht, he approaches the container again to retrieve his anchor. With some difficulty, he hauls it back onto his boat, readjusts it, and sails away from the container. Descending into the cabin, he discovers everything flooded, the electricity out, and water rising above knee level. After examining the hole, he sets about inspecting the equipment. Fetching a small wooden box, he mixes marine epoxy resin for patching holes. Using it in combination with sailcloth, he seals up the hole. In the meantime, he fashions a lever from a wooden stick to manually pump water out of the cabin. As night falls, he settles into a hammock suspended in the cabin above the water, ready to rest. In the morning, he resumes repairing the yacht. Bringing the electrical devices onto the deck, he tries to revive them by rinsing with fresh water and drying them. Then, he proceeds with patching the hole, pumping out water, and having dinner while observing the ocean and the sunset. After completely pumping out the water, he cleans the floor of salt and checks the patched hole for strength. Tilting the sailboat to one side, he ensures that water isn't seeping in. Opening a hatch in the floor, he retrieves one of the flooded batteries, takes it onto the deck, and attempts to connect a radio to it. Unfortunately, the radio remains silent, indicating it's still not functioning. Turning to paper charts, he tries to determine his location but comes up empty-handed. Heading back into the cabin, he locates the book Celestial Navigation for Yachtsmen and begins studying it. Suddenly, he hears the radio picking up signals. Rushing back to the deck, he transmits the SOS signal, but despite his efforts, nobody responds, and the radio eventually fails altogether. Disheartened, he descends into the cabin, opens a bottle of liquor, prepares dinner, and retires to sleep. The next morning, he resumes his repairs. Climbing the mast, he notices a storm looming in the distance. Quickly descending to the deck, he stows away all items, securing everything in the cabin. He fills a large container with fresh water and tidies up himself, preparing for the approaching storm. Outside, the wind howls fiercely, rain pelts down relentlessly, and waves violently crash against the yacht. Donning a raincoat, the man resolves to deploy a sea anchor to maintain course. He secures himself and ventures onto the deck with the anchor. Struggling against the elements, he attempts to unpack and toss it overboard, but a colossal wave engulfs him, dragging him into the unforgiving ocean. After a harrowing struggle, he manages to clamber back aboard the yacht, utterly drained, and seeks refuge in the cabin. Overcome by nausea, he retches from ingesting seawater. Shedding his sodden attire, he senses something amiss. Just then, the yacht begins to spin wildly. Peering out of the window, he witnesses the sailboat teetering on the brink of capsizing. Yet, a powerful surge from the next wave rights the vessel. Ascending to the deck once more, the man resolves to make another attempt at deploying the anchor, only to be thwarted as another wave violently flips the boat. Miraculously, both he and the yacht emerge unscathed. Surveying the damage, he notices the fractured mast. Weary beyond measure, he retreats to the cabin, but before he can take more than a few steps, the yacht lurches, sending him tumbling. His head collides with a post and he loses consciousness. When he regains consciousness, he finds the sailboat flooded once more, water streaming in through breaches in the hull. Summoning all his strength, he manages to rise to his feet, retrieving the inflatable life raft. Despite the continuing tempest, he maneuvers onto the deck and lowers it into the raging sea. Taking refuge within the raft, he seals it tightly from all sides, bracing himself against the relentless storm until morning. Upon awakening the next day, he witnesses the sorry state of the wrecked yacht, nearly submerged and beyond salvage. Making his way to it, he resolves to descend into the cabin, salvaging essentials, food, instruments, charts, drinking water, clothing, and a hat. Hauling his finds into the raft, he deliberates before returning to the cabin once more, retrieving a box submerged underwater. With salt water stinging a cut on his forehead, he tends to the wound, cleansing it and applying a specialized bandage. Suddenly, he detects unfamiliar sounds, realizing the yacht is sinking at an alarming rate, prompting him to evacuate urgently. Climbing back onto the raft, he watches with a heavy heart as the sailboat succumbs to the depths, vanishing beneath the unforgiving waves. Opening the retrieved box, he unearths a sextant, at last pinpointing his location with its aid. The following day, he awakens to find water accumulating at the raft's base. Desperately, he attempts to bail it out and dry it, but his efforts prove futile. Before long, the ominous sounds of another approaching storm reach his ears. Peering out, he spots the darkening skies and advancing tempest. Securing his belongings and determining his location, he seals the raft tightly, bracing for the impending storm. The inflatable raft is relentlessly buffeted by powerful waves, tossing it from side to side until it eventually flips over, plunging underwater. Emerging from the turmoil, the man struggles to right the raft, eventually succeeding in hauling himself back aboard. As morning breaks and the storm abates, the man resolves to pump air into the raft, only to discover that the hand pump is broken. Resorting to bailing out water with a cup from the raft's bottom, he reassesses his location, realizing he's being carried into a busy shipping lane by the current. Upon opening his food supplies, he recoils in disgust as they're saturated with seawater. His attempt to quench his thirst with water yields the same salty disappointment. Overwhelmed by despair, he fights off hysteria, a desperate plan forming in his mind, crafting a solar still from a container to obtain fresh water. Spotting fish nearby, he improvises a fishing rod and casts it into the ocean. Meanwhile, a small amount of water accumulates in the makeshift still, providing him with a precious sip of refreshment. Consulting the sextant once more, he confirms his location in the shipping lane, filling him with hope as he scans the horizon for passing ships. After what feels like an eternity, a large vessel comes into view. Hastily searching for signal lights, he manages to ignite one in a bid for attention. However, his efforts go unnoticed as the container ship sails past without noticing him. Frustrated and disheartened, he tosses the light into the water, watching the ship fade into the distance. Lost in his disappointment, he's slow to realize that he's hooked something on his makeshift fishing line. Slowly reeling it in, he's horrified to discover a shark caught on the line, accompanied by others swarming around his raft. At night, the man is jolted awake by the sound of a passing ship. Desperately, he grabs his flare gun and fires one flare, then another. Despite his efforts, the ship sails on, oblivious to his plight. In the morning, he takes a sip of water and determines his location again, only to find that he has drifted out of the shipping lane. Despair washes over him. Acknowledging the gravity of his situation, he decides to write a letter, seal it in a bottle, and cast it into the ocean, hoping someone might eventually find it. That night, exhausted and on the brink of losing hope, he wakes to the sight of distant ship lights. Reaching for his signal flares, he discovers they are all gone. Desperation fuels a new idea. He empties his container of water, stuffs it with paper, and sets it on fire. The initial flame is weak and likely invisible, so he adds more paper, feeding the fire until it blazes fiercely. But the fire soon rages out of control, engulfing the entire raft. He jumps into the water, watching helplessly as his last refuge burns. Accepting the inevitability of his fate, he surrenders to the water, looking at the stars one final time as he starts to sink. As he descends into the depths, a sudden beam of a searchlight pierces through the darkness. A boat appears above him. With a final surge of strength, he propels himself upward, grasping the outstretched hand of his rescuer.